Thank you for those kind and generous words. Thank you to the committee for giving me this honor to give today's or this year's Edward Said Memorial Lecture. In today's lecture, I aim to think the question of justice through the writings of Aimé Césaire and Nelson Mandela. I also propose to reflect on the end of apartheid as a way to critically rethink the legacy of Nuremberg as understood by the contemporary human rights movement. And I should close with a reflection on contemporary Israel and Palestine. Aimé Césaire's haunting and lyrical poem, Notebook on the Return to My Native Land, was first composed in 1939. This anti-colonial text circulated in various forms until a definitive edition was issued by Présence Africaine in 1956. Soon after, it became a signal text of negritude. I've often thought of how differently Léopold Senghor and Aimé Césaire conceptualized negritude. It was a difference between two rather different perspectives, one anchored in geography and biology, the other in history. Senghor famously claimed that emotion is Negro as reason is Greek, and further, that European reason is analytical, but African reason is intuitive and integrative. Senghor anchored negritude in a separate, glorious African past. For Césaire, negritude is a subjectivity shaped from the depths of oppression, underlined by a single overriding condition, that of the toiler. Allow me to quote from Césaire's poem at some length. Césaire begins by renouncing any claim to a glorious racial past. No, we have never been Amazons of the king of Dahomey, nor princes of Ghana with 800 camels, nor wise men in Timbuktu under Askia the Great, nor architects in Deje, nor Mahdis, nor warriors. Under our armpits we do feel the itch of those who bore the lance. And since I have sworn to hide nothing of our history, I want to declare that we were from the very first quite pitiful dishwashers, shoeshiners without scope, and at best, rather conscientious sorcerers, whose only incontestable achievement has been the endurance record under the lash. Then follow these memorable lines. Those who invented neither powder nor compass, those who have tamed neither gas nor electricity, those who did not explore the sea or the sky, but they know in their innermost depths the country of suffering, those who knew of voyages only when uprooted. But what strange pride suddenly illuminates me. This strange pride is the claim to a different history, a history anchored in Haiti, revolution, and Toussaint. Haiti, where negritude stood up for the first time and swore by its humanity, a single man defying the white cries of white death, a man alone in the sterile sea of white sand. From this dawn is born what Césaire terms my virile prayer. Make me the executioner of these mighty deeds, but so doing my heart, preserve me from all hatred. Do not make of me that man of hate for whom I feel nothing but hate. For cantoned in this unique race, you know, however, that my tyrannical love is not out of hatred for other races. That I am the toiler of this unique race. What I want is for the universal hunger, for the universal thirst. I call the race to be finally free, to produce out of its closed intimacy that succulence of fruit. And here is how Césaire concludes this virile prayer at the end of the dawn. It is not true that the work of man is finished, that we have nothing to do in the world, that we are parasites in the world, that we have only to accept the way of the world. But the work of man has only begun. And it remains for man to conquer all prohibitions immobilized in the corners of this fervor, and no race has a monopoly of beauty, intelligence, strength, and there is room for all at the rendezvous of conquest. And we know that the sun turns around the earth, lighting only the portion that our single will has fixed, and that every star falls from the sky to earth at our limitless command. Now, this limitless vision, this unhindered optimism, encountered an historical obstacle when Aimé Césaire went to Haiti. Césaire visited Haiti for 7 months in the spring of 1944, from May to December. He recalled the trip several decades later, and I quote, "In Haiti, I saw above all what should not be done. A country that had supposedly conquered its liberty, that had conquered independence, and what I saw was more miserable than Martinique, a French colony. The intellectuals intellectualized. They wrote poems. They took positions on this or that issue, but with no connection to the people themselves. He observed peasants, quote, working often like chained animals. They were real but pathetic." Césaire remarked on, quote, "the cohabitation of liberty and continued servitude, this tragic dichotomy," and added, "It was tragic. It could also have happened to us, Martinicans." Colin Dayan writes that Césaire arrived in Haiti in 1944, a poet, and returned home later that year, a politician. Upon returning to Martinique, Césaire was asked to run on the Communist Party ticket for mayor of Fort-de-France, and won easily in May 1945. In October, he was deputy to the First National Constituent Assembly and went to Paris to work on the new constitution of the Fourth Republic. Césaire no longer wanted Martinique to be independent from France, free and sovereign. Free, yes, but not sovereign. In 1956, Césaire called for departmentalization, evoking Toussaint's ambiguous formulation, free and French. It was a road to which Toussaint had gestured, but it was a road he did not take. Césaire's explanation was that Toussaint made only one mistake, to be ahead of his time, and by a good century and a half. It was another way of saying that Toussaint could not have seen the aftermath, the consequences of the revolution he led and made. By 1960, Césaire was on the cusp of another bitter disappointment. He had hoped that Martinique would realize a free and French future within a French federation. But that promise turned out to be a deception, which he described as a false universalism, masking a reality in which the rights of man have shrunk often enough to be but the rights of the European. Césaire had reached an impasse. The cherished legal rights that had been achieved with departmentalization, he cherished those, but lamented growing cultural and social inequity, recognizing that the terrible contradiction of departmentalization could only be resolved by the negation of departmentalization. I want to compare the aftermath of Aimé Césaire's journey to Haiti with Nelson Mandela's sojourn. first to independent Africa as commander of MK, then to reflecting on that independence decades later. 1960 was the year of the Sharpeville massacre in South Africa. In its aftermath, the ANC set about organizing an apparatus for armed struggle, known as Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, the Spear of the Nation. At its helm was Nelson Mandela. Mandela visited selected African countries looking for training opportunities and financial assistance for the armed struggle. He recalled the experience in his book, Long Walk to Freedom. A highlight of the trip was Algeria. In Mandela's words, the closest model to our own. But that is where the resemblance ended. The decades that followed recorded a sharp difference in both the nature of the struggle and its outcome in the two countries. Faced with the reality of an independent Algeria, 1 million pieds noirs left for France. In South Africa, however, most settlers stayed, becoming part of the post-apartheid political community. They were among the survivors of apartheid. From Algeria, Mandela went to Senegal. Events confirmed his early impressions. Quote, "I had been told to be wary of Senghor, for there were reports that Senegalese soldiers were serving with the French in Algeria, and that he was a bit too taken with the customs and charms of the Ancien Regime. On meeting Senghor, the delegation summed up the situation in South Africa and made our request for military training and money. But Senghor was not obliging, pleading that his hands were tied until Parliament met. Senghor advised the delegation to talk to the Minister of Justice about military training. Mandela continues, quote, "Senghor introduced me to a beautiful white French girl who, he explained, would interpret for me in my meeting with him. I said nothing, but was disturbed. Senghor sensed my uneasiness, for he said, 'Mandela, do not worry. The French here identify themselves completely with our African aspirations.' Mandela picks up the narrative at the minister's office. One of the black secretaries asked the French woman what she was doing there. She said she had been sent by the president to interpret. An argument ensued, and in the middle of it, one of the African secretaries turned to me and said, 'Sir, can you speak English?' I said I could, and she replied, 'The minister speaks English, and you can talk with him directly. You don't need an interpreter.' The French girl, now quite miffed, stood aside. Recounting the episode with a straight face, Mandela leaves us to draw our own conclusions. Mandela returned to South Africa. He was arrested, prosecuted, and jailed for a long 27 years. Over the 2 decades that followed the Rivonia trial of 1963-64, there was a sea change in South African politics. The single most important motive force making for this change was not the armed struggle, nor exile politics, nor the international boycott movement. That force was provided by student activists of all colors. To understand the significance of the student movement of the 70s, we need to understand the practical consequences of the armed struggle declared by the ANC and the PAC in the aftermath of the 1960 Sharpeville massacre. The vision of the professional revolutionary was patterned after Lenin's injunctions in What Is to Be Done. The cadres of the armed struggle were expected to constitute a vanguard whose mission would be to lead and liberate the people. But the opposite happened. The more activist elements moved away into exile for military training, the more the population was left leaderless and immobilized. Capital took command. Economic historians speak of the 60s as the second major significant period in the industrial transformation of South Africa, the first being the 1930s. But unlike the first, this second wave of industrialization in the 1960s was driven by foreign investment. Politically, the 1960s were a decade of relative silence, the silence of the graveyard. Not only the economy, but even anti-apartheid politics continued to be defined by the framework set in place by apartheid. Apartheid had divided the whole population into 4 so-called population groups: Africans, Indians, coloreds, and whites. In response, each population group organized as a separate race. Africans as the African National Congress, Indians as the Natal Indian Congress, first organized by Gandhi, coloreds as the Colored People's Congress, and whites as the Congress of Democrats. These separate racially demarcated resistance groups came together under the Congress Alliance. In retrospect, it seemed the mode of governance introduced by colonialism and perfected by apartheid had become naturalized as the mode of resistance against it. The silence of the 60s was shattered by student activism in 2 successive phases. First, the Durban General Strike of 1973, then the wave of township protests following police shooting of unarmed student protesters in Soweto on June 16, 1976. Direct action by students was a response to what had become evident to all, that the armed struggle was a propaganda weapon at best and an empty boast at worst. Direct action developed out of student attempts to organize their own ranks against apartheid. Student initiatives began with the attempts to reach across the color boundary. First came an initiative by the liberal wing of the white student movement, NUSAS, the National Union of South African Students, to admit black students within their ranks. The experience led to black students, led by Steve Biko, resolving that even if students were inspired by a common goal, a non-racial South Africa, black students would have to organize separately outside the structure of white hegemony and paternalism. This separate organization was the South African Students' Organization, SASO, out of which grew the Black Consciousness movement. Black Consciousness, or BC, was a mobilization with a difference. Black, said Biko, is not a color. If you are oppressed, you are black. BC included African, Indian, colored students. It was a historic break with the mindset of apartheid. By the beginning of the 1970s, anti-apartheid students were separately organized in 2 different racial formations, white and black. Separately, and sometimes in contention, the white and black wings of the anti-apartheid student movement reached out to mobilize wider sections of society against apartheid. Black consciousness students moved to the townships, and white students organized migrant worker hostels on the fringe of townships. The social peace enforced by apartheid was breached spectacularly by the strike movement that began in Durban in 1973 and then spread to the Cape and the Rand. The important point is that radical white students played a catalytic role in this development. Though few in numbers, they provided strategic leadership in the burgeoning independent unions of the late 1970s and early 1980s. A few years after the 1973 Durban strikes came the uprising known as Soweto 1976. Its core organizers were black students who would inspire a generation of struggle leading to community organizing and community-based resistance. The significance of Soweto was threefold. First, Soweto shifted the initiative from professional revolutionaries in exile to community-based activists. Second, it shifted the focus from armed struggle to direct action. The youth of Soweto had no more than stones to throw at gun-toting police. In both these respects, Soweto evokes the First Intifada in Palestine. And third, Soweto signaled a vast shift in popular perspective. The 2 sections of the student activists organized the workplace and the community. The former marching under the banner of a non-racial unionism, and the latter under black consciousness. Both pioneered a practice that moved away from armed to unarmed but militant popular struggle. Out of this two-pronged initiative developed two wings of the labor movement, one based on migrant hostels, the other in the townships, both drawing their respective vision from two racially distinct sections of the student movement. The first to be organized in 1979 was FOSATU, Federation of South African Trade Unions. Its core was made up of unions that had been organized following the spontaneous strike wave in Durban and Pinetown in 1973. Its constitution emphasized non-racialism, workers' control of trade unions, and worker independence from party politics. The big change from a trade unionism that stayed an arm's length from liberation movements to an explicitly political unionism came with the foundation of COSATU in 1985. COSATU and the Communist Party were a central part of this strategy. Though relatively few in numbers, white students had been of strategic significance. They had been key organizers of FOSATU. Later, they joined the Communist Party and the ANC. And when the time came, they provided effective channels of communication, including role models for the white population. At the same time as the anti-apartheid struggle mobilized the black population, it educated the white population. It challenged apartheid's claim that there could be no white security without a white monopoly of power. Imperceptibly, it set in motion the process of realizing a non-racial future. This new generation of youth soon found its way inside the South African prison system, including Robben Island, where Nelson Mandela had been locked up for years. It was from Winnie that Nelson got his first hint about what was different about this new generation of youthful militants. Quote, "On a visit with Winnie a few months before, she had managed to tell me through our coded conversation that there was a rising class of discontented youths who were militant and Africanist in orientation. She said they were changing the nature of the struggle and that I should be aware of them, or I should be aware of them." Listen to Mandela's account of his prison encounter with the youth of Soweto. In September, the isolation section was filled with young men who had been arrested in the aftermath of the uprising. These young men were a different breed of prisoner from those we had seen before. They were brave, hostile, and aggressive. They would not take orders and shouted "Amandla" at every opportunity. Their instinct was to confront rather than cooperate. The authorities did not know how to handle them, and they turned the island upside down. Shortly after their arrival on the island, the commanding officer came to me and asked me a favor to address the young men. He wanted me to tell them to restrain themselves, to recognize the fact that they were in prison, and to accept the discipline of prison life. I told him that I was not prepared to do that. Under the circumstances, they would have regarded me as a collaborator of the oppressor. These fellows refused to conform to even basic prison regulations. One day I was at the head office conferring with the commanding officer. As I was walking out with the major, we came upon a young prisoner being interviewed by a prison official. The young man, who was no more than 18, was wearing his prison cap in the presence of senior officers, a violation of regulations. Nor did he stand up when the major entered the room, another violation. The major looked at him and said, "Please take your cap off." The prisoner ignored him. Then in an irritated tone, the major said, "Take off your cap." The prisoner turned and looked at the major and said, "What for?" I could hardly believe what I had just heard. It was a revolutionary question. What for? The major also seemed taken aback, but managed to reply. "It is against regulations," he said. The young prisoner responded, "Why do you have this regulation? What is the purpose of it?" This questioning on the part of the prisoner was too much for the major, and he stomped out of the room saying, "Mandela, you talk to him." But I would not intervene on his behalf and simply bowed in the direction of the prisoner to let him know that I was on his side. The popular mobilization of the 1980s followed Durban 1973 and Soweto 1976. By the mid-1980s, the rebellion in the townships had reached the scale of an uprising that made the townships ungovernable. It is this popular mobilization that forced the regime to look for a negotiating partner and discuss the twin issues of majority rule and minority rights. When Mandela had his first meeting with the government's secret working group in May 1988 at a posh officers' club within the precincts of Pollsmoor prison, their primary question was, how would the ANC protect the rights of the white minority? They wanted to know. The following year in March, Mandela sent a memorandum to State President Botha. Among others, the memo addressed the minority question. Quote, "Two political issues will have to be addressed. Firstly, the demand for majority rule in a unitary state. Secondly, the concern of white South Africa over this demand, as well as the insistence of whites on structural guarantees that majority rule will mean domination of the white minority by blacks. The most crucial tasks which will face the government and the ANC will be to reconcile these two positions." Upon his release in 1990, Mandela pressed the issue at his first press conference. Quote, "I wanted to impress upon the reporters the critical role of whites in any new dispensation. I have tried never to lose sight of this. We did not want to destroy the country before we freed it, and to drive the whites away would devastate the nation. I said there was a middle ground between white fears and black hope, and we in the ANC would find it. Whites are fellow South Africans, I said, and we want them to feel safe and to know that we appreciate the contribution that they have made towards the development of this country. Any man or woman who abandons apartheid will be embraced in our struggle for a democratic, non-racial South Africa." Why the fear? That to drive the whites away would devastate the nation, and the consequent determination. We did not want to destroy the country before we freed it. What had changed? When was Mandela's moment of epiphany? What lessons did Mandela draw from Algeria or Mozambique, two colonies where the new leadership had been uncompromising in their demand for justice, and where most colonial settlers had chosen to leave rather than become citizens of the new state? Had Mandela come to see Mozambique as Césaire had a latter-day Haiti, a warning against letting justice turn into revenge, determined to avoid such an outcome in South Africa? If Mozambique highlighted one side of the dilemma, when does a relentless pursuit of justice turn into revenge? The post-apartheid transition would highlight the reverse predicament. When does reconciliation turn into an embrace of evil? That is, social inequality. In rethinking the Freedom Charter and formulating a constitution for a new South Africa, Mandela had begun to unpack justice from a singular to a plural concept, differentiating political from social justice. Critics will later argue that Mandela may have erred in focusing exclusively on the question of political equality and thus ignoring the other side of the coin, social equality. To assume that political equality would be a natural stepping stone to social equality would be to ignore the tension-filled relationship between the two. Those familiar with Marx's classic essay on the Jewish question will recall that the question of social equality becomes particularly poignant once the political kingdom is attained. It is the attainment of political equality that brings the day-to-day quotidian experience of social inequality into sharp relief. This tension is best expressed in two notable speeches given by Thabo Mbeki during his time as president. I am an African and two nations. The first speech, I am an African, marked the adoption of the Constitution Bill by the Constituent Assembly of the Republic of South Africa on 8th May 1996. It took on the question, would yesterday's settlers be accepted as citizens of the new deracialized South Africa, or will they be flushed out of the colony, like the Pied Noir in Algeria, to make way for a racially cleansed independent country? Mbeki's answer was unequivocal. Quote, I am formed of the migrants who left Europe to find a new home on our native land. Whatever their own actions, they remain still part of me. I am the grandchild who lays fresh flowers on the Boer graves at St. Helena in the Bahamas, who sees in the mind's eye and suffers the suffering of a simple peasant folk, death, concentration camps, destroyed homesteads, a dream in ruins. I am an African. South Africa, Thabo Mbeki was saying, will take a road different from Algeria. It was a grand vision, Lincoln-esque, fitting for a statesman about to be at the helm of the new South Africa. But visions have first to be made real and then durable. And that work is not done with an oration. It calls for determined action by organized social forces. If building a common polity was the promise of the new South Africa, its challenge was the realization of social justice for the vast majority who had been forcibly excluded from the common journey until only yesterday. The subject of Mbeki's second speech, given in the opening of the National Assembly debate on reconciliation and nation building 2 years later, on 29th May 1998, was this stark history which had given rise to what he called two nations. Some on the intellectual and political left welcomed the speech for addressing so much unfinished business, the difficult but inevitable challenges posed by white class privilege. Others dismissed it as a rhetorical gesture that had come too late. I want to suggest that the post-apartheid transition deserves a more complex reading, one that can place it in a wider global frame. I propose to read it as a critique of Nuremberg and the contemporary human rights movement, as offering an alternative logic for societies in the throes of civil war and mass violence. Nuremberg was the trial at which the victors of the Second World War judged the war's vanquished. The legacy of Nuremberg defines the problem as one of extreme violence, radical evil, and then poses the question as follows: who is responsible for this violence? This is the old Agatha Christie question. Who done it? Not why it happened, but who did it? It is the question of crime and punishment. State orders, we are told, cannot absolve officials of individual responsibility. Above all, this responsibility is said to be ethical, not political. The lesson of Nuremberg is to think of violence as criminal and to underline responsibility for violence as individual. Inasmuch as it individualizes our understanding of mass violence and responsibility for it, Nuremberg should be considered a founding moment of a neoliberal understanding of mass violence. Today, Nuremberg is also understood as a call for victims' justice. Victims' justice after Nuremberg took a very particular form: state creation. Nuremberg had been conceived as part of a larger political logic shared by the victorious Allied powers. This was, at its core, a nationalist logic, that winners and losers, victims and perpetrators cannot live in a single state. They must be physically separated into different political communities. So the Allies redrew boundaries and transferred millions across borders. In the process, they carried out or sanctioned the most extreme ethnic cleansing in modern history. The possibility of victims' justice flowed from the assumption that there would be no need for winners and losers to live together after victory. Perpetrators would remain in Germany and victims would depart for another homeland. The culmination of this logic was the creation of a separate state, Israel, for survivors of the Holocaust. As interpreted by the human rights movement, the lesson of Nuremberg is that criminal justice is the only morally acceptable and politically viable response to mass violence. Nuremberg is today the model for the International Criminal Court, held up as the court of law authorized to judge every incident of mass violence, every crime against humanity. To de-ideologize Nuremberg would be to give it a historical context. It would mean, first of all, to recognize that the logic of Nuremberg flowed from the context of interstate war, one that ended in victory for one side, which then put the losers on trial. The logic of a court trial is zero-sum. You are either innocent or guilty. This kind of logic ill-fits the context of a civil war. Victims and perpetrators in civil wars often trade places in ongoing cycles of violence. No one is wholly innocent and no one wholly guilty. Each side has a narrative of victimhood. From this point of view, victims' justice is the flip side of victors' justice. Both demonize the other side and exclude it from participation in the new political order. A civil war can end up as a renegotiated union or as a separation between states. The logic of Nuremberg drives parties in the civil war to seek military victory and the separation of yesterday's perpetrators and victims into two separate political communities. That the founding moment of the South African transition is not a set of criminal trials, but political negotiations, is mainly the result of a radically different context. Apartheid was not a war between states, it was a civil war. The contemporary human rights movement is permeated with the logic of Nuremberg. Human rights groups focus on atrocities for which they seek individual criminal responsibility. Their method of work has a formalized name, naming and shaming. The methodology involves a succession of clearly defined steps: catalog atrocities, identify victims and perpetrators, name and shame the perpetrators, and demand that they be held criminally accountable. The underside of the focus on perpetrators is to downplay issues. Read the field reports of Human Rights Watch or those that follow its aspiration, and you will find that except for a pro forma page or too-long introduction on history and context, the focus is on naming and shaming. Indeed, context is considered a distraction from establishing the universality of human rights. The first thing about the contemporary human rights movement is that it anchors itself ideologically in the lessons of defeat, not revolution. In this, it is markedly different from the human rights movement that followed the French Revolution. Whereas the movement organized around the revolutionary banner, Rights of Man, was highly political, the contemporary human rights movement is consciously anti-political, which is the meaning it gives to the notion of human and humanitarian. The negotiations that ended apartheid provide us with the raw material for a critique of the universal claims of the current human rights paradigm. I suggest that the present rush for courtroom solutions advocated by the human rights community is the result of a double failure, analytical and political. Analytically, it confuses political violence with criminal violence. Politically, the focus on perpetrators is at the expense of a focus on issues that drive the violence. As such, it is likely to magnify rather than mitigate violence in the public sphere. What distinguishes political from criminal violence? The key difference is this: political violence requires more than just criminal agency. It needs a political constituency. More than just perpetrators, it needs supporters. That constituency, in turn, is held together and mobilized around an issue. More than criminal violence, political violence is issue-driven. To break out of the cycle of violence, we need to displace the victim narrative with that of the survivor. A survivor narrative is less perpetrator-driven, more issue-driven. Atrocities become part of a historical narrative. They no longer stand as so many standalone acts, but part of an ongoing cycle of violence. To acknowledge that victim and perpetrator have traded places is to accept that neither can be marked as a permanent identity. The consequence is to humanize the perpetrator. The talks between different political forces in South Africa, which negotiated the terms for the end of apartheid, were known as CODESA, Convention for a Democratic South Africa. Nuremberg and CODESA need to be thought of as two radically different responses to political violence. Each was a response to a crime against humanity. Each has an implication for how we think of human wrongs and thus of human rights. Whereas Nuremberg shaped the notion of justice as criminal justice, CODESA calls on us to think of justice primarily as political justice. Whereas Nuremberg has become the basis of a notion of victims' justice as complement rather than an alternative to victors' justice, CODESA provides the basis for an alternative notion of justice, which I call survivors' justice. The ground for CODESA was prepared by a double acknowledgement by both sides to the conflict. To begin with, both sides recognized that there was little prospect of ending the conflict in the short run. For those far-sighted in the leadership, this was equivalent to a recognition that their preferred option was no longer within reach. Neither revolution for liberation movements nor military victory for the apartheid regime was on the cards. If South Africa is a model for solving intractable conflicts, it is an argument for moving from the best to the second best alternative. That second best alternative was political reform. The quest for reform, for an alternative short of victory, led to the realization that if you threaten to put the leadership on either side in the dock, they will have no interest in reform. This change in perspective led to a shift away from criminalizing or demonizing the other side to treating it as a political adversary. Its consequence was to displace the paradigm of criminal justice identified with Nuremberg. Instead of excluding the perpetrator from the political process, the challenge was how to include them in the political process. Second, whereas Nuremberg was informed by a logic of ethnic cleansing, one that called for a separation of yesterday's victims and yesterday's perpetrators into separate political communities, there was no question of creating in South Africa and Israel for the victims of apartheid. Instead, it was clear that victims and perpetrators, black and white, would have to live in the same country. Rather than put justice in the back seat, CODESA presents us with a radically new way of thinking about justice. It presents us with a double breakthrough. To begin with, CODESA distinguishes between different forms of justice: criminal, political, and social. It prioritized political justice, the reform of the political system, over the other two. The difference between political and criminal justice is twofold. One, political justice affects groups, whereas criminal justice targets individuals. Two, the object of criminal justice is punishment. That of political justice is reform. In the process, CODESA also moved the goalpost. The goal was no longer the internment and punishment of individuals charged with so many crimes, but a change of rules. A change of rules that would include them and their constituencies into a reformed political community. CODESA's achievement was to get adversaries to agree on a political reform which dismantled legal and political apartheid and redefined an inclusive citizenship. As I have written elsewhere, the point was not to avenge the dead, but to give the living a second chance. The logic that permeated the South African transition was the opposite of victims' justice. It was informed by the assumption that yesterday's victims and yesterday's perpetrators have no choice but to live in the same state. To be able to do so, they need to forge a new identity, the identity of the survivor. In this sense, a survivor is not simply a victim who survived yesterday's catastrophe. A survival is all, whether victim, perpetrator, beneficiary, bystander, all who survived that catastrophe. All must be born again, politically, rather than in a religious sense. This is the political legacy of post-apartheid South Africa. This legacy is that of political equality in the aftermath of colonialism. I wish to identify it as political justice, as distinct not only from criminal justice, as promised at Nuremberg, but also from the social justice that South Africans seek today. Not only is political justice the way out of war, it may also be the most prudent way to social justice. The lesson of South Africa is to look for the solution within the problem and not outside it. The point is to strive for internal reform and not external intervention. CODESA has a double significance. By focusing on the cycle of violence as threatening the very foundation of a political community, CODESA presents us with a challenge. It dares us to reimagine the political community by recognizing in the after effects of violence an opportunity to refound the political community. In doing so, it challenges us to think of political violence, civil war in particular, as potentially foundational to the creation of an inclusive political order. I would like to close with a return to Edward Said. I recall a conference Edward and I brainstormed over a decade ago at Columbia University. This conference, organized at the Institute of African Studies, was called An Anti-Apartheid Reflection on Israel and Palestine. Edward was to be the last speaker at the conference. He called me up that morning and said he wouldn't be there for the first session because he was going to the hospital for chemotherapy. But after chemotherapy, he would come and talk. I asked him, "Are you sure you'd have the energy to talk after chemotherapy?" He said, "Yes, for Palestine." I think it was his last conference. Then as now, thinking of South Africa was a way to think of Palestine. There was one question on everybody's mind. Was South Africa the right analogy for Israel and Palestine? I tried to synthesize the discussion at the end of the conference. I said the answer could be neither a simple yes nor a simple no. The big difference between South Africa and Israel was evident in the language used by Boers and Zionists. Boers never claimed that South Africa had been an ancestral home to which they had a right to return. But Zionists did. Unlike the Boers in South Africa, the Zionist coming to Palestine thinks of himself and herself as a returning native. I suggested that we take this difference seriously, for it is likely to open up new parallels, such as one with African Americans in Liberia. Like Jews in Palestine, African Americans in Liberia too saw themselves as returning natives. But the parallel did not end there. In both cases, the returning native looked at the native who never left, the Palestinian in Israel, and the African in Liberia, as a squatter who may have been on the land but had made no worthy contribution to it. From this point of view, this squatter could not possibly have any rights to the land. Finally, in both cases, the returning natives saw themselves as the bearers of a civilizing mission. They had been to the Promised Land, USA, from where they were now returning with a mission to civilize the homeland and the squatter. Now that the civilizer was back, the squatter must step out of the way. It is amazing how deep-seated was this assumption. I recall the words of W.E.B. Du Bois in what I think was his last speech in Beijing when he was 92 years old. Du Bois reminisced sadly, as if repenting, that like other African Americans in leading positions, he too had assumed that when the time came, it would be African Americans who would show the way forward to Africans, and not the other way around. Let me conclude. What is justice after apartheid? Let us not confuse the struggle for political justice with a struggle for a day in court. Political justice is not the same as criminal justice. Our objective is not a day in court, but equal citizenship. When change comes in Israel-Palestine, and change will, our primary objective cannot be to look backward to settle scores. It has to be to look for a more inclusive political arrangement. The purpose of decolonization cannot just be to turn the world upside down. We have to change it. That is the lesson we need to take from South Africa in particular and the anti-colonial movement in general. Thank you.